For what purpose does the gentleman from New Jersey seek recognition?
Madam Speaker, I move to suspend the rules and pass H.R. 3375 as amended.
The clerk will record the title of the bill.
H.R. 3375, a bill to amend the Communications Act of 1934 to clarify the prohibitions on making robocalls and for other purposes.
Madam Speaker, I ask unanimous consent that all members have 5 legislative...
Gentleman will suspend. Pursuant to the rule, the gentleman from New Jersey, Mr. Pallone, and the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Burgess, each will control 20 minutes. The chair recognizes the gentleman from New Jersey.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I ask unanimous consent that all members have 5 legislative days in which to revise and extend their remarks and include extraneous material on H.R.
Without objection, so ordered.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. And I yield myself such time as I may consume.
Gentleman is recognized.
Madam Speaker, I rise in strong support of H.R. 3375, the Stopping Bad Robocalls Act, bipartisan legislation that I introduced with Ranking Member Walden, Communications and Technology Subcommittee Chairman Doyle, and Subcommittee Ranking Member Latta. This legislation advanced out of our Energy and Commerce Committee last week by a unanimous vote of 48-0. The rising tide of unlawful, unwanted robocalls started as a nuisance, but now threatens the way consumers view and use their telephones. These calls are undermining our entire phone system, and that's something we all need to take very, very seriously. Last year, there were an estimated 47 billion robocalls made to Americans. It's no wonder that the American people have lost confidence in answering their phones. And the Stopping Bad Robocalls Act will help restore that confidence, and that's very important in my opinion. Madam Speaker, Americans use their phones at some of the most important times of their lives. They use their phones to get help from first responders by calling 911, to hear important medical test results from their doctor, to connect with or reassure a family member or friend, to learn the school is closed tomorrow, or just to conduct daily business. Illegal, unwanted robocalls threaten the foundational ways that we communicate with one another, and that, in my opinion, is dangerous. Each time a consumer chooses not to pick up the phone out of fear that a scam robocall is on the other end of the line, it chips away at our community and public safety. Too frequently, consumers feel their best option is to not answer their ringing phone, which may lead them to miss an important call. And it's truly unfortunate that consumers feel they must take that risk in order to proactively defend themselves against a scam call. Some studies estimate that nearly half of all calls this year will be scam calls. And these calls are not only harmful to the American people, but they're also harmful to business. The Chief Information Security Officer of the Moffitt Cancer Center recently testified before our committee that scammers were calling his hospital, disguised as Department of Justice officials, demanding to speak with a physician about his medical license. And robocalls are dangerous to public health and to people's privacy, using this as an example. We've heard similar stories of scammers disguised as the IRS, looking to collect a debt, scammers disguised as local governments or police departments, and scammers disguised as loved ones in trouble looking for help. We're even seeing new scams, such as the One Ring scam, where fraudsters try to trick consumers into calling back international numbers in the hopes that the consumer will rack up large charges. And all of these scams are different, and there's no silver bullet to fix them all. And for that reason, this legislation takes a comprehensive approach to cut off robocalls at many different points. For example, the bill would implement a nationwide caller authentication system, free for consumers, so they can again trust that the number they see on their caller ID is actually the person calling them. In that same vein, consumers need more help controlling the calls they have asked not to receive. Consumers need to be in charge of their own phone numbers, and scammers or telemarketers must have a consumer's consent before making calls. Consumers should be able to block illegal and unwanted calls, but with blocking, there needs to be transparency and effective redress so that we ensure the calls people want are actually getting through. And what's more, Madam Speaker, we need to ensure that law enforcement and the Federal Communications Commission have the tools, information, and incentives to go after robocallers that break the law. So this bill takes all these steps and more. It also includes the text of many important proposals that would help address the onslaught of robocall consumers that they face. And I just want to mention some of the other bills that were introduced that we've tried to incorporate in this bill. One is the Ending One Ring Scams Act, the Tracing Back and Catching Unlawful Robocallers Act, the Locking Up Robocallers Act, the Spam Calls Task Force Act, and the Protecting Patients and Doctors from Unlawful Robocalls Act. And I want to I'll thank the sponsors of those more specifically later during this debate. But ours is a strong and comprehensive bill that puts consumers first. And I want to thank all of my colleagues that have shaped this bill with me, specifically Mr. Walden, Mr. Doyle, Mr. Latta, of course. But I also want to thank all the consumer advocacy organizations and the carriers that worked hard to reach a consensus piece of legislation that will take tough and meaningful steps to protect consumers from these annoying and illegal robocalls. The legislation, Madam Speaker, now has 237 sponsors, and I'm hopeful that it will garner strong bipartisan support today when we vote. I urge all of my colleagues to put consumers first and join us in passing the Stopping Bad Robocalls Act. And with that, I will reserve the balance of my time.
Gentleman reserves. Gentleman from Texas is recognized.
Madam Speaker, I yield myself such time as I may consume.
Gentleman is recognized.
So, Madam Speaker, I rise today in strong support of H.R. 3375, the Stopping Bad Robocalls Act, and I'll speak more later on my contribution to this legislation, but I congratulate the authors of this legislation, both the majority and the minority. The American Association of Retired Persons sent us a letter yesterday urging the adoption by stating H.R. 3375 promotes an accurate call authentication framework and prevents consumers from being charged for blocking technology. The support does not end with them, but it spans the consumer and industry groups that have seen the impact of this. This bill incorporates the best of the private sector solutions, at the same time putting the call out to crack down on these illegal actors for the criminals that they are. We are going to shut these scammers down. This legislation establishes a more rigorous enforcement structure to shut down illegal robocalls. It empowers the Federal Communications Commission with additional enforcement. It also sets the path for providers to implement new caller ID technologies with no new line item charges to the consumers. The fraud committed on Americans by illegal robocallers is going to stop. This bipartisan legislation creates a robust framework designed to protect consumers from the fraud and nuisance of these calls. I'm now pleased to recognize the ranking member of the full committee, Mr. Walden, for 4 minutes.
The gentleman is recognized.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I want to thank my colleagues for their work on the Stopping Bad Robocalls Act. To Chairman Pallone, to Chairman Doyle, to Congressman Latta, and everybody that's been involved in this. I think we've come to a really good agreement here, and it will help stop the illegal robocalls. Hopefully all 47.8 billion. Let that number sink in. Last year in America, 47.8 billion calls were made to all of us, and they were mostly all illegal, and we're going to do our best to stop them, Madam Speaker. You'll be hard-pressed to find a technology that's more personal than your phone, whether it's the phone you carry in your pocket or, for some, a landline at home. And how we communicate on these devices is essential in the way that we connect to one another. Yet that personal connection is being violated by bad actors that have compromised our country's communications networks and who hide their tracks with their own hardware and software, Madam Speaker. These criminal parties have done significant harm to Americans both personally and professionally. Those who engage in such illicit behavior should be treated and prosecuted for what they are, criminals. From the outset of our legislative effort to address this problem, I stated we must make a clear distinction between parties that have ill purpose as opposed to those who do not. After all, we don't want to shut off legitimate uses of these new technologies, such as protecting the anonymity of a women's shelter, assisting at-risk individuals, or alerting you to a fraudulent use of your credit card, or providing you the simple convenience of interacting with your rideshare service. Those are legitimate purposes. Our clearest and quickest path for passing legislation along with our friends in the Senate and ultimately to become laws to go after those that have malicious intent. And to go beyond that would have undermined our services Americans depend on every day. So I think we found the right balance here. By taking all this into account, we can achieve the same kind of bipartisan, bicameral success as exemplified by the Ray Bombs Act last Congress, which notably provided us with the launching pad for where we are today. Now, that law provided the FCC with more authority to go after bad actors who utilize calls and texts. Our work from then was echoed by a broad bipartisan group of attorneys general from across the United States calling for the FCC to move on updating its own rules. Now, we know communications and technologies are constantly evolving, and unfortunately, the bad actors' tricks evolve beyond our do not call registry, and I'm sure they will continue figuring out a way to get around this effort. However, the more friction we can create against illicit behavior, the more focused public-private partnerships we can create among industry, consumer groups, and government will help us root out this problem, prosecute these criminals to the fullest extent of the law, and make great strides in regaining Americans' confidence in their communication devices. Now, in the 35 town halls I've held in my district this year and phone calls I get to my office, people ask one question. I'll bet they've asked it of you, Madam Speaker. What are you going to do to stop these robocalls? Well, I'll tell you what, this is a number you can answer, 3375. That's the number of the bill. Pick it up, answer it, vote yes, and we will put an end to these robocalls, at least for now. And with that, Madam Speaker, I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman reserves. The gentleman is recognized.
Madam Speaker, I'd like to yield 2 minutes now to the gentlewoman from California who chairs our Health Subcommittee, Ms. Eshoo.
Gentlewoman is recognized.
Thank you, Madam Speaker, and my thanks to the chairman of the full committee, the ranking member, Mr. Walden, the ranking member of the subcommittee, Mr. Latta, and the distinguished chairman of the subcommittee, Mr. Doyle, for bringing forward this bipartisan legislation. I hope when the vote is taken on this today by the full House that it is unanimous. And if it is, and it should be, I think we're going to hear applause from across the country because the American people have been bombarded by robocalls every day. Last year, as has been stated, Americans received an unfathomable 48 billion, with a B, robocalls. So this is an epidemic, and anyone with a phone knows this. I hear it from my constituents daily. I think we all do. I've been subjected to them. All of my colleagues have been subjected to them and their families as well. And these calls are not only highly annoying, they're also used to scam people and to swindle them. Last year, an estimated 43 million Americans were scammed out of $10.5 billion. That's a lot of money. And I have some friends, intelligent people, who were convinced by the story at the other end of the line. So the American people, for all the legitimate reasons, are demanding that we do something. And today I think we're delivering a victory for that. I'm certainly proud to co-sponsor the legislation. And as been said, no one bill can completely solve a complex problem. So the FCC and Congress have to remain vigilant to ensure that the statutory and the regulatory protections are sufficient to protect the consumers. There are heavy fees for violators in this bill, so it's really going to cost them. And it's not simply paying because it's a cost of doing business. So I urge all of my colleagues to support this.
It's expired.
I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman reserves. Gentleman is recognized.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. At this time, I'm pleased to recognize the gentleman from Ohio, the ranking member of the Telecommunications Subcommittee on the Committee on Energy and Commerce, for 3 minutes, for Mr. Latta.
Gentleman from Ohio is recognized.
Well, thank you very much. And I thank the gentleman for yielding. And thank you, Madam Speaker. I rise today because robocalls have to stop. With the help of our phone carriers and the FCC, we've crafted solid legislation in the Stopping Bad Robocalls Act. But the most important voices heard in the crafting of this bill were the men and women from our districts who have had to deal with these calls. Illegal robocalls are annoying, disruptive, and harmful. Sadly, Madam Speaker, for many people in Ohio and across the country, these calls have also ruined lives. I hosted a workshop geared toward helping seniors avoid becoming victims of scams, including illegal robocalls, and the stories are heartbreaking. We heard from seniors who have been manipulated into giving away their life savings to scammers, often because they were tricked into thinking someone they loved had been hurt. They've been told that if there was a way for them to know that it was an illegal robocall before they answered that call, this could have possibly been prevented. That is one of the many solutions we offer in the Stopping Bad Robocalls Act. I'm proud to have contributed with language from our own Stop Robocalls Act, which would make it easier for Americans to access robocall blocking technology through their phone companies on an informed opt-out basis. Prior to our legislation and the FCC ruling, these services were available to consumers who opted in to receive them. This restriction made the number of customers using blocking technology very low. This legislation will change that. Madam Speaker, Americans deserve peace of mind knowing that the phones that connect us to the world are being used for good and not scams. I want to thank the gentleman from New Jersey, the chairman of the full committee, the gentleman from Pennsylvania, the chairman of the subcommittee, the gentleman from Oregon, the Republican leader of the full committee, for working with us in this legislation. I also want to thank our great staffs for all the hard work that they did in making sure that we got this legislation to the floor today. I urge my colleagues to support H.R. 3375, and Madam Speaker, I yield back the balance of my time.
I'll reserve.
Gentleman reserves. The gentleman from New Jersey is recognized.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I yield now 2 minutes to the gentleman from Pennsylvania, Mr. Doyle, who chairs our communication.
Gentleman is
You want more than that?
recognized.
No. 2 minutes to the gentleman from Pennsylvania, who chairs our communications and technology.
Gentleman is recognized.
Thank you, Chairman Pallone. Mr. Speaker, today the House will vote on the Stopping Bad Robocalls Act legislation introduced by Chairman Pallone, Ranking Member Walden, Ranking Member Latta, and myself. This bill addresses a problem that we all have firsthand experience with: persistent, annoying, nonstop robocalls. Americans received nearly 48 billion robocalls last year, a 60% increase from the year before. That number is expected to increase to 60 billion this year. In June alone, in my hometown of Pittsburgh, we received an estimated 34 million robocalls. On average, everyone in this country receives 14 of these calls every day. This bill is a comprehensive bipartisan solution that I believe will help seriously reduce the onslaught of illegal robocalls that Americans face. The bill before the House today is the result of bipartisan negotiations which included industry and public interest stakeholders. This bill was reported unanimously out of the Communications and Technology Subcommittee, which I chair, as well as the full Energy and Commerce Committee. I'm also pleased that the language from Stop Robocalls Act, which Ranking Member Latta and I introduced, was included in this bill. These provisions allow phone carriers to automatically enable robocall blocking services by default on phone lines. While these technologies have been available on an opt-in basis, too many of our seniors, and frankly, too many people in general, just don't know about these services and how to sign up for them. Allowing these services to be enabled by default allows all consumers to benefit from these technologies without having to go through the onerous sign-up process, particularly for seniors and those most vulnerable to scam calls. These provisions also include requirements that the new opt-out robocall blocking services do not result in new consumer fees. The bill also requires all carriers to adopt call authentication technology, which would enable people to be certain that the number that they see, can I have 15 more seconds?
You want another 30 seconds or
Yes,
a minute?
please.
30 seconds.
Gentleman is recognized for 30 seconds.
Call authentication technology that would enable people to be certain that the number they see on their caller ID is really the number the call's coming from. All too often, people get calls that look like they're coming from down the street, but are really coming from scammers half a world away. This legislation came about through hard work of majority staff and minority staff of the Energy and Commerce Committee, and I would like to thank both staffs on the majority and minority for their hard work and diligence to get this bill to the floor. I urge my colleagues to support this bill, and I yield back.
Gentleman reserves. The gentleman is from Texas is recognized.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. At this time, I'm pleased to yield 2 minutes to the gentleman from Florida, Mr. Bilirakis.
Gentleman is recognized.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I appreciate it. And thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Ranking Member. Robocalls and spoofing have been a burden on Americans for years. It's very simple. It goes without saying. We must end these bad robocalls. Our constituents are fed up. At a hearing 3 years ago, I was able to highlight a constituent who received hundreds of calls daily to his home phone. His quality of life became so poor, Madam Speaker, he had to replace his phone hardware and phone number to get the peace he deserved in his own home. The Stopping Bad Robocalls Act will help ensure that situations like this become less frequent and eventually non-existent. This bill will provide much-needed authority for the FCC to develop rules for blocking robocall violators and enhance the ability to pursue these bad actors and bring them to justice for taking advantage of the American people, especially our seniors. I'm also pleased this package includes the Ending One Ring Scams Act, which Representative Clark and I introduced this year. This provision will direct the FCC to target one of the newest forms of caller scams and show that we are serious in combating all forms of illegal phone fraud, no matter the tactics used. I strongly support the Stop Bad Robocalls Act, and I urge the Senate to pass this much-needed legislation as well. I yield back, Madam Speaker. Thank you.
Gentleman reserves. Gentleman from New Jersey is recognized.
Madam Chair, I now recognize another gentleman from California, Mr. McNerney, for 2 minutes.
Gentleman is recognized.
Well, I thank the chairman for his hard work on this, and the chairman of the subcommittee, Mr. Doyle, the ranking member, the staff members. Great bill here. And I rise in support of H.R. 3375, the Stopping Bad Robocalls Act. Today, Californians and Americans across the country are receiving more unwanted robocalls than ever before. This is something I often hear about from my constituents. Nearly 48 billion robocalls were made in 2018, an increase in 17 billion calls in just 1 year. More than 40% of these calls are illegal scams. They're defrauding consumers, they're disruptive, and they're costing victims an average of $430 per scam. I'm worried that the real risk here is that we're making our phone system obsolete because people just don't want to pick up their phones anymore. Part of the problem is that our current legal framework doesn't go far enough in deterring these harmful practices. That's why I'm pleased that H.R. 3375 includes an amendment that I offered with my colleague, Mr. Flores, during our full committee markup. Our provision will create disincentives for the most egregious violators of the law. Specifically, our provision will empower the Federal Communication Commission to assess an additional $10,000 penalty for robocall violations where the offender acted with intent to cause the violation. Creating these disincentives is critical for protecting consumers and putting abusive practices to an end. I'm proud to co-sponsor this bipartisan, common-sense legislation. I urge my colleagues to vote yes, and I yield back.
Gentleman reserves. The gentleman from Texas is recognized.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. At this time, I'm pleased to recognize the gentleman from Ohio for 1 minute.
Gentleman from Ohio is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I rise in strong support of H.R. 3375, the Stopping Bad Robocalls Act. These unwanted and annoying robocalls, which are increasing at an alarming rate, need to end. I'm very pleased that the House has set aside partisan differences and worked together on legislation to benefit all Americans and address this serious issue. This important legislation would require service providers to implement new technology that ensures caller ID is authenticated and establishes additional protections for consumers receiving unwanted and sometimes fraudulent robocalls. I'm also pleased that H.R. 3375 includes legislation that I sponsored with my colleague Representative Butterfield, which would require the FCC to publish an annual report on the private-led efforts to trace the origin of unlawful robocalls, an important step in stopping these bad actors from reaching consumers. This kind of illegal, annoying, and harassing activity must stop, and I encourage my colleagues to join me in supporting this legislation. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for giving me time, and I yield back the balance.
The gentleman reserves. The gentleman from New Jersey.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I yield now to the Vice Chair of our committee, the gentlewoman from New York, Ms. Clark.
Gentlewoman from New York is recognized. How much time?
I'm sorry, Madam Chair, for 2 minutes.
Gentlewoman from New York is recognized for 2 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. As Vice Chair of the Energy and Commerce Committee, I rise today to thank the House Energy and Commerce Committee Chairman, Frank Pallone, Ranking Member Walden, and Subcommittee Chair Mike Doyle and Ranking Member Latta for their leadership on this bipartisan effort to bring this important piece of legislation to the floor. Today, I want to speak to the intrusive reality and damaging repercussions of robocalls and voice my support for H.R. 3375, the Stopping Bad Robocalls Act. While the illegality of these calls is an issue, the insistent presence of them is causing American citizens to no longer view their phone as a legitimate form of communication, thus impacting legitimate business. Adding to this, robocalls are actively hurting the pockets of Americans as multitudes are scammed daily, costing the American public millions of dollars. During committee markup, I introduced the Clark-Bilirakis Amendment based on the base bill ending One-Ring Scams Act of 2019, and I thank Mr. Bilirakis for his leadership. This was a bipartisan effort to ensure that the American people are protected from this harmful scam culture of one-ring scams. The nature of these one-ring scams may seem ridiculous. However, they've been effective in scamming the American people. With one-ring scams, the goal of the scammer is not for you to answer, but rather for you to make the call back. One-ring calls may appear to be from phone numbers somewhere in the United States, including initial digits that resemble U.S. area codes. If one calls back, the citizen risks being connected to a phone number outside of the United States, thus resulting in one being charged a fee for just connecting. Ad nauseum, the good people of Brooklyn's 9th Congressional District have voiced their outrage with the state of their security and privacy as the threat of one-ring scams grow more prevalent. Before I conclude my remarks, I would be remiss if I did not thank my colleagues who helped lead on today's effort, Congressman Bilirakis, Congressman Van Drew, and I want to say to those who are fraudulent, today, game over. Madam Speaker, I yield back.
The gentleman reserves. Gentleman from Texas is recognized.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. At this time, I'm pleased to recognize the gentleman from Montana, Mr. Gianforte, valuable member of our Energy and Commerce Committee, for 1 minute.
Gentleman is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Montanans are bombarded with robocalls. Last year alone, Americans received over 48 billion robocalls. That's nearly 100,000 robocalls per minute. Too many robocalls are deceptive and destructive, from bogus insurance offers to threats of legal action. Scam artists scheme to steal hardworking Montanans' private, personal, and financial information. Sometimes they go even farther. A young woman from Bozeman received a call from her little brother's phone number. She picked up the call, but it wasn't her brother. It was a scammer using her brother's number. Tragically, her little brother had died of a drug overdose a few months earlier. She was devastated and shaken. This is disgusting and should not happen. Today, we're taking a big step forward. We're empowering consumers. Phone companies will provide consumers with call authentication tools and blocking services at no cost. Illegal callers will face more jail time. Let's get robocall relief across the finish line for the American people. I encourage my colleagues to pass this legislation,
Gentleman's time
and I
has
yield
expired.
back.
Gentleman reserves. Gentleman from New Jersey is recognized.
Madam Chair, I yield 1 minute to the gentleman from Florida, Mr. Christ.
Gentleman from Florida has 1 minute.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Thank you, Chairman Pallone, for your leadership on this incredibly important legislation, and to the ranking member. The American people are fed up with spam calls. They are predatory, incessant, and an invasion of privacy. We need a comprehensive approach to root them out, and our federal government plays an important role in that. Whether it's the FCC, the Department of Justice, Homeland Security, or the FBI, these agencies should have the authorities and tools to shut down these spammers' calls. And these powers are maximized when they are coordinated. That's why included in this legislation is the creation of the Spam Calls Task Force. The task force will coordinate the federal response. I want to also thank Representative Darren Soto for his help with this. I'm confident that by working together, we can all put a stop to spam calls once and for all, and Americans will no longer have to fear for robocalls. Thank you again, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Gentleman reserves. Gentleman from Texas is recognized.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. At this time, I'm pleased to recognize the gentlelady from Washington State, Ms. Catherine McMorris Rogers, for 1 minute.
Gentlewoman is recognized for 1 minute.
Madam Speaker, I rise in support of this legislation, the Stopping Bad Robocalls Act. We all agree, robocalls are annoying and they're a nuisance. What's worse is that these calls are often scams that are becoming more and more sophisticated each day. When our phone rings, we're just one answer away from being a victim of identity theft. That needs to change. So this legislation will restore trust that Americans can again answer their phones. Madam Speaker, I have a constituent who calls my office nearly every time he receives a robocall. He's begged us to do something. After today, I look forward to sharing with him that we listened and took action to solve this problem. On his behalf and on all those that I have the privilege of representing in Eastern Washington, I urge support of the Stopping Bad Robocalls Act. And I yield. I reserve.
Gentleman from New Jersey is recognized.
Madam Chair, I yield 1 minute now to the gentlewoman from Florida, Ms. Murphy.
Gentlewoman from Florida is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Congress has a terrible reputation for being too partisan, but there's one issue that has strong bipartisan agreement in this Congress and across this country, and that is fraudulent robocalls must be stopped. I hear these concerns from my constituents in Central Florida on a regular basis. It's one of the top issues that constituents routinely write my office about. Americans received over 48 billion robocalls last year. Nearly half of the calls that Americans receive are robocalls, many trying to scam people out of their hard-earned money. Floridians have received over 2.2 billion robocalls so far this year alone, and my hometown of Orlando is among the most targeted cities in the country, having received nearly 350 million robocalls. Robocalls are more than a nuisance. They pose a direct threat to consumers. Often disguised using fake caller IDs like hospitals and government agencies, robocallers attempt to trick people into providing personal information and preying especially on our seniors. The American people have had enough, and they're demanding swift action from this body. I'm proud to help introduce this bill, which is a great first step to protect Americans from robocall harassment. I urge my colleagues to support it. Thank you, and I yield back.
Gentleman reserves. Gentleman from Texas is recognized.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. This time I'm pleased to acknowledge the gentleman from Georgia and yield to him 1 minute, a valuable member of the Energy and Commerce Committee, Mr. Carter.
Gentleman is recognized for 1 minute.
I thank the gentleman for yielding. Madam Speaker, I rise today in support of the Stopping Bad Robocalls Act. This legislation will seek to stem a problem affecting nearly everyone I know. That is the issue of robocalls. Last year, we had almost 50 billion robocalls in the United States. This year, we've already had almost 30 billion robocalls, or roughly 90 robocalls per person. It's an issue that everyone can agree on is a nuisance and should be addressed. That's why I join my colleagues in supporting this legislation to end this practice and once again make it possible to answer a phone call from a phone number you don't recognize. This bill will give the FCC the authority to move forward with changes under the Telephone Consumer Protection Act and to ensure that these changes will lead to an effective effort to get rid of unwanted robocalls. Not only will we see a greater ability to stop these, but we'll see penalties that will hopefully deter future efforts by bad actors. I applaud my colleagues on the Energy and Commerce Committee for their work on this legislation, especially since it's an issue that affects everyone. For this reason, I urge my colleagues to support this legislation and to help us get this bill to the finish line, and I yield back.
The gentleman reserves. Gentleman from New Jersey is recognized.
Madam Speaker, I yield 1 minute to the gentleman from Tennessee, Mr. Cohen.
Gentleman from Tennessee is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you, Mr. Pallone, and thank you, Madam Speaker. This issue has brought everybody together. It seems to be more popular than ice cream or even fried chicken. It's amazing such a bill could come about. But it is important because we get these calls and it takes up our time. I've got a landline and I've got 2 cell phones. I don't even answer my landline anymore. And when I come home from a trip, coming up to Washington, I go home, my service is full of automatic dialers, robocalls, and constituents who want to get through can't get through because the answering machine has been used up. They try to take advantage of people, scam them into buying products they shouldn't, and they waste our time, and they ruin our opportunity to have a regular life during the day. So I thank all the sponsors. I'm proud to be a supporter and a co-sponsor, and look forward to voting for this, and look forward to the day when I can pick up my phone and it'll be Bear Bryant or somebody looking out to reach out to call his mama. Thank you.
Gentleman reserves. Gentleman is recognized.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. At this time, I'm pleased to recognize the gentlelady from Indiana, Ms. Brooks, valuable member of the committee, and yield her 1 minute.
The gentlewoman is recognized for 1 minute.
I thank the gentleman for yielding. Madam Speaker, we've all gotten robocalls. They're annoying, disrupting, and actually can be dangerous. Oftentimes, robocalls prey on our community's most vulnerable populations in hopes to capitalize on their personal and private information. And unfortunately, this problem's growing. H.R. 3375, the Stopping Bad Robocalls Act, is a bipartisan solution, ensuring that calls consumers receive are verified as legitimate. I'm also pleased that the legislation includes a bill that I was an original co-sponsor of called Locking Up Robocallers Act. It requires the Federal Communications Commission to report particularly malicious robocall schemes to the Justice Department so that federal resources may continue to be properly levied to stop these schemes. As a former U.S. attorney, I'm really proud that the Justice Department, in working with the FTC and local law enforcement, actually has already taken enforcement actions in over 94 cases, which has yielded blocking of more than 1 billion robocalls so far. I'm reassured that with this bill, they will be able to more efficiently and consistently pursue and prosecute robocaller abusers. And for these reasons and many more, I urge my colleagues to support this bill, and I yield back balance of my time.
Gentleman reserves. The gentleman from New Jersey is recognized.
Madam Speaker, can I inquire as to the amount of time on each side?
The gentleman from New Jersey has 3 minutes. The gentleman from Texas has 6 minutes.
So I'd like to yield now 1 minute to the gentlewoman from Illinois.
Gentlewoman from Illinois is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. 64. That's the number of robocalls that the average Illinoisan has received in 2019 alone, over 1 billion total. Nationwide, half of all calls to cell phones are robocalls. Yesterday in my staff meeting, our discussion of floor consideration of the Stopping Bad Robocalls Act was literally interrupted by 2 different robocalls. So, Mr. Chairman and Mr. Ranking Member, on behalf of myself and my community, Illinois' 14th Congressional District, thank you for your hard work to bring this common sense, bipartisan, and incredibly important bill to the floor. Robocalls aren't just annoying, they can be dangerous. They're used by fraudsters and unscrupulous debt collectors to scare hardworking Americans into falling for their scams. I'm so proud to co-sponsor the Stop Bad Robocalls Act. This bill ensures that consumers can block calls they don't want with no extra charge. It ensures that every call Illinoisans receive is verified by caller ID, and it strengthens enforcement against scammers and robocall operators. I'm especially glad the bill includes a provision to require the FCC to establish a hospital robocall working group to ensure that robocalls don't threaten hospitals' ability to provide timely life-saving care. I strongly urge my colleagues to support. I yield back. Thank you.
Gentleman reserves. Gentleman from Texas is recognized. Gentleman reserves. Gentleman is recognized.
Madam Speaker, I'm prepared to close. I don't know if the gentleman has any more speakers.
No, I'm prepared to close. I'll yield myself the balance of our time.
The gentleman is recognized.
So robocalls have moved beyond a simple nuisance. Sophisticated actors are now using robocalls to trick people into providing sensitive information by posing as legitimate organizations. When this happens to hospitals, patients have no reason to believe that there is a fraudulent actor on the other line, leading them to reveal sensitive health data, sensitive financial information. This activity threatens the integrity of real health-related phone calls and jeopardizes the relationship between the patient and their provider. Even more challenging than explaining to consumers that the calls from your phone number are not always from your organization is the response time required. According to testimony by Dave Summit of the H. Lee Moffitt Cancer Center, in a 90-day period, they received over 6,600 external calls identified as a Moffitt internal phone number, requiring 65 hours of response time. This is time that could have been used to support the hospital rather than respond to fraudulent calls. During the energy Commerce Committee markup, I offered an amendment with Ms. Dingell of Michigan to establish a hospital robocall protection group at the Federal Communications Commission. This group will issue best practices to help combat unlawful robocalls made to hospitals, as well as those made spoofing a legitimate hospital phone number. The Hospital Robocall Protection Group will assist any hospitals to combat these fraudulent robocalls so that they may focus on serving patients. A patient should not have to worry about whether they are speaking with their real doctor or their real hospital when discussing sensitive health information, and providers should not have to deal with disruptive false claims. This amendment was adopted in committee, and I look forward to the best practices being put forward in the Hospital Robocall Protection Group. The fraud committed on Americans by illegal robocallers is going to end. This bipartisan legislation creates a robust framework designed to protect consumers from the fraud and nuisance of these calls. I thank you and urge a yes vote on the underlying legislation and yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields back. The chair recognizes the gentleman from New Jersey.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I yield myself the remaining time. Mr. Speaker, I'd like to thank all of the members that were able to work together to produce this great legislation, and there are a lot. I want to thank Mr. McEachin, Mr. Olson, Mr. Kim, Ms. Brooks, Mr. Brindisi, and Mr. Kustoff for introducing the Locking Up Robocalls Act, which was added to this legislation in Section 9. Also thank Ms. Clark, Mr. Bilirakis, Mr. Van Drew, Mr. Ruda, Ms. Fox, and Mr. Wahlberg for introducing the Ending One-Ring Scams Act, which was added to this legislation in Section 10. Thank Mr. Chris for introducing his Spam Calls Task Force Act, which was added to the legislation in Section 11. Mr. Butterfield, Mr. Johnson, Mr. Soto, and Mr. Gianforte for introducing the Tracing Back and Catching Unlawful Robocallers Act, which was added in Section 13. And then thank Ms. Dingell and Dr. Burgess for introducing their Protecting Patients and Doctors from Unlawful Robocalls Act, which was added to the bill in Section 14, and Mr. Flores and Mr. McNerney for offering their amendment to increase the financial penalties for illegal robocallers. I also, of course, want to thank my partners, Mr. Walden, Mr. Doyle, and Mr. Latta, for working with me to introduce the bill, which included an introduction, Mr. Latta and Mr. Doyle's Stop Robocalls Act in Section 8. Now, I also would like to quickly thank the staff, Alex Honsarek, A.J. Brown, Jennifer Epperson, Dan Miller, Robin Caldwell, Tim Kurth, for all their hard work, and in particular Jerry Leverage, who's here, for all his time and energy to get this bill to the floor today. I'm very proud of all our members and staff of this important bill. Last, I would also, I intend to insert a few letters and statements for the record. Without objection, a letter from AARP on behalf of its nearly 38 million members urging a vote in favor of the bill. Second, a letter from more than 80 organizations representing consumers throughout the U.S., including Consumer Reports and the National Consumers Law Center, among others, urging strong support by members of the bill. And third, a list of supportive statements from carriers and relevant associations, including U.S. Telecom, the Broadband Association, CTIA, the Wireless Association, NCTA, the Internet and Television Association, Charter Communications, and Verizon. Again, this is a bipartisan effort, and it's also a bicameral effort, and we're not doing messaging here, Mr. Speaker. This is a bill that will become law, and the President will sign it once we get it passed in the Senate and we have a final bill. So with that, I yield back the balance of my time.
Thank you. The question is, will the House suspend the rules and pass the bill H.R. 3375 as amended? Those in favor say aye. Aye. Those opposed say no.
On that, I would ask for the yeas and nays.
Two-thirds being in the affirmative. The gentleman from New Jersey.
I would ask for the yeas and nays, Mr. Speaker.
The yeas and nays are requested. All those in favor of taking this vote by the yeas and nays will rise and remain standing until counted. A sufficient number having risen, the yeas and nays are ordered. Pursuant to Clause 8 of Rule 20, further proceedings on this question will be postponed.